Hello, this is Eric Topol with my co-host Abraham Verghese, and this is a new Medicine and the Machine podcast. And we're really pleased today to have Bapu Jena, who is a physician and economist at Harvard, who has written with his colleague Christopher Worsham a new book called Random Acts of Medicine, a fascinating book. And so, Bapu, welcome.
Thank you for having me. Thank you both.
Yeah, let me start things off. I mean, this is really a very interesting book, and I think the whole medical community, no less the public, will find it extraordinarily interesting. You start off in a way with what you call natural experiment.
Yeah.
Which many people might say, oh, that's just an observational study. Can you tell us what do you mean by natural experiments and how they're different from or potentially better than randomized study?
So when we think about randomized experiments, I mean, they're quite common in medicine. So if someone takes a drug, if we're lucky, it's been subject to a randomized trial where investigators randomize a group of people to one drug and another group to another drug or a placebo. And that allows you to say something about the causal effect of getting that drug because everything else is being held constant by virtue of the randomization. The opposite of that is what we think of as a straightforward observational study in which you just look at people who in the real world take that drug and then you compare them to people who take the other drug. And you hope that the factors that led them to take that drug are not correlated in some way with the outcome of interest. And everything is just going through the mechanism of action of that drug. Now, that usually is not the case because there's a selection involved. People choose to take certain medications or someone recommends it to them for a host of very personalized reasons, some of which a researcher could observe, but many of which a researcher cannot observe. And we call that problem confounding. And that's why observational studies are often not relied upon, let's say, by the Food and Drug Administration. Now, there's something in between, though, which we call natural experiments, which is a scenario where nature essentially randomizes people to one intervention versus another. And we use the term quasi-randomizes because it's not at the hands of an investigator. And there, we think that we're getting more close to the causal effect of the intervention. So it is observational in the sense that we are looking back at data that already exists. That part is true, but it's not the same as an observational study because we're really taking serious this issue that the way that a person happens to be on an intervention in the real world is typically not random. So we want to find situations where it is as good as random.
I want to say how much I enjoyed your book. It was, to me, a succession of fascinating stories. And I'm just marveling at the way your mind works. And it made me think of this not very well-known tradition of MD economists. We had Alan Garber here as our colleague for a while, and then he had a cadre of MD PhD economists, and you're clearly in that tradition. Talk a bit about what led you into that area of MD with a PhD in economics.
And I'd spent some time in college working in a basic science lab, and I wanted to do an MD and a PhD in something like immunology or cell biology, something like that. But I studied economics in college only because I thought to myself, wow, I've applied to medical school. I need to round out my background a little bit. Let me study a quote-unquote humanity. And economics is about as far from the humanities as I could think of. But that was my logic at the time. Fast forward a few months, I'm applying to medical schools. I visit the University of Chicago, and the director of that MD PhD program noticed that I studied economics, and he says to me in sort of an offhand way, would you want to do your PhD in economics instead? And that was how it happened. It was sort of very random in that respect, and it's, taken my life down a completely different path than it otherwise would have gone down.
I found so many of the book parts intriguing, but my favorite chapter was on left digit bias. That is like the retail thing where, in fact, the name of the chapter is what do cardiac surgeons and used car salesmen have in common? Wherein the car is priced $1 or less and it has a bias, the left digit bias. And you presented many graphs of what you call discontinuity, or what has been known as discontinuity, whereby whether it's heart attacks or who cardiac surgeon do bypass surgery on, or kidney transplants, or opiate medications, one after another. You show this left digit bias. So can you talk about that? Because I'm really how come we're so stupid?
Yeah, I think it's human nature. So what's kind of, it's not human nature to be stupid, but let me put it, humans aren't perfect, and doctors are humans. So there's like the transitive property, doctors aren't perfect. Yeah, if you go to the grocery store and you see a bag of Doritos and it's $1.99, the reason it's $1.99 is because the mind looks at that leftmost digit, a 1, and it feels cheaper than 2, even though it's only a penny cheaper. And you don't see stores, for example, relying on pricing of $1.63 versus $1.64 to try to shift consumers to purchase a product. It's something specific about that left digit. Now, that's all fine and good, right? It's not surprising that you could trick a human being into purchasing a bag of Doritos at the margin that they may or may not have purchased had the price not been $1.99. What surprised me, though, is that you would see the same sort of thing happening in a really high-stakes decision, one that is arguably really well thought out and for which the implications for people are enormous, right? And so in the book, we talk about some of our own work, which looked at people who came to the hospital with a heart attack. And for some group of these people, a cardiac bypass surgery may make sense. And what we show is that if you happen to come to the hospital just a week shy of your 80th birthday, let's say 79 years old in 50 weeks, you are more likely to receive a cardiac bypass surgery than if you came just a week and a half later when you're 80 years old in 1 week. And it's because the doctor looks at the patient and says, oh, they're in their quote-unquote 70s, or you're in your quote-unquote 80s. And the older patients are, the less likely doctors are to want to do invasive things to them. And so that was a finding. And it is interesting to me because it shows that the same sort of behavioral heuristics that apply in other parts of our life, or that might apply in a laboratory setting where a researcher might study it, happen in this really high stakes setting, which is, quite important. But the second thing that's important is that it also shows us how behavioral economics can create these quasi-experiments where people are, by chance, randomized to getting a CABG surgery versus not. And then you can look at the outcomes 1 year later and see what happens.
While we're on that question that Abraham brought up about different physicians, one of the things that you got to at many points in the book were the kind of features of what makes for best performing physicians. And I'd like you to comment on 2 of these, and then later we'll get to the cardiology convention. But the one about women that you found, and also about the differences and features between, let's say, hospitalists and surgeons, where older may be better. So can you comment about those 2? Because they're really interesting, and they may not be what I think a lot of our listeners in the Medscape community already appreciate.
Sure, yeah. So let me start with the age one first. The origin of that study, that idea was, if you're a patient and you walk into a room and you see a really young doctor walk into the room, you might be concerned. And you might be concerned that they don't have a lot of experience in the practice of medicine. And if I'm being honest with myself, as I think about when I try to find medical professionals for my family or my friends, I'm not typically looking and saying, okay, who is the doctor fresh out of residency training or fellowship? I'm looking years out because I have this perception that experience matters. But ultimately, that does become an empirical question, but it's not an easy one to solve, because if patients believe that older, more senior doctors are more experienced and will have better outcomes for them if they're particularly sick, who are those doctors going to attract in the real world? They're going to attract patients who are sicker. So you can't simply look at older versus younger doctors and say anything about the causal effect of being seen by one of those 2 types of doctors. You've got to construct a scenario where people are by chance seen by older or younger doctors. And that's where the hospital-based doctors come in, or we call them hospitalists. In that scenario, if you've got a 45-year-old doc who works on Monday, a 35-year-old doc on Tuesday, a 65-year-old doc on Wednesday, that's all random. And if you're coming to the hospital with chest pain or shortness of breath, you don't go there knowing that the 30 or the 65-year-old doc happens to be in the hospital that day. It's random. And so that allows us to uncover that causal effect. And what we see in the medicine-based docs is that two things. One is that the older the doctor is, the worse the outcomes are. And the outcome here is hospital mortality. How likely are you to survive 30 days after that hospitalization? Something we'd all care about. And that effect starts pretty soon after residency. So it's not like we're comparing 80-year-old internists who work in the hospital to 35-year-old docs. We're talking about every 5 years you see a bump up in mortality the further you get out from residency. But the benefit is preserved among doctors who are higher volume. So if you're an older doc and you still maintain a high volume of patients, you don't seem to pay that cost that comes with the older doc who does not maintain that high volume of patients. So there is a silver lining there when it comes to the internist. For the surgeons, we find the opposite, actually, that the older docs tend to have better outcomes. And there we're focusing on emergency surgeries where we think that the allocation of the patient to the doctor is kind of random. So that, let me just pause on that. That's the older doc, younger doc finding.
Yeah, I think that's really important just because it demonstrates how you drill down on things. That first you keep helping to clarify what you and Christopher meant by natural experiments, but also that you don't just do like one layer of analytics. You just keep going and going. And that's what, of course, was a theme throughout various chapters in the book. Hand it over. Abraham, did you want to comment on that part?
I was just going to say that that hospitalist story was painful to read, but I kind of knew it was true because I attend, less and less often, but I'm very conscious that, I'm really not as up on the hospital protocols as my junior colleagues. So I'm really reaching out to them all the time. But I had the illusion maybe that I brought a level of wisdom by keeping bad things from happening to patients that they didn't need, diagnostic tests and so on. But I really think that rings true, even though I didn't want to accept it.
Well, you were specifically excluded, so we can't generalize this to you. In fact, I think it's probably the opposite. I think you're just getting better and better. But that's the point, right? It's like the older you are, you do have that experience. And one thing that we didn't do in our study, but we, thinking about it, we should have done, is maybe it's in rarer diseases, more uncommon presentations of common diseases as well, where you might see experience shine a little bit more brightly. Whereas if we're talking about management of more routine problems, where it's just the technology, the science is evolving very quickly, and someone might not be up to date, that's a sort of different ballgame.
But can I just clarify on that hospitalist point? Did you match their volume of patients in the sense that, I think when you're a young hospitalist, you take a lot of shifts, many more than I'm willing to do. And as you get older, you might take less shifts because you have children and obligations and so on. You matched for the number of patients seen and so on.
Yeah, exactly. And we actually show that if you focus on the higher volume older hospitalists, they do just fine. And that's because they continue to maintain that volume. There's another piece that we had in JAMA Internal Medicine a couple of years ago, which is not in the book, but conceptually it's very similar, where we look at docs who are primarily clinically focused versus, to be honest, people like me who spend some time clinically, but spend a lot of time doing other stuff. And just on average, the clinically focused docs tend to have better outcomes, meaning lower mortality. Again, that's not surprising. That's not true for every single doc, but on average, that's what you see.
Now, maybe you want to get to the advantage of women.
Yeah, I say the more controversial one I was going to warm everybody up first. So that was another study again. But Eric, to your point, we recognize that some of these findings are going to be controversial. So it is important to do as much as we can, all the bells and whistles to make sure that what we're finding we think is credible. In that same chapter, we look at the outcomes between male and female doctors. And we have done a lot of work in the past looking at gender differences in promotion and pay. And we've shown that, even when you account for otherwise similar work, we're looking at people who are similarly productive clinically, and from a research perspective, men get promoted faster, they get paid more. And this is for equal work. So that question hasn't been looked at as much in the clinical context, meaning what are the outcomes of women doctors versus men doctors. And again, you have that same problem of the types of patients who see women versus men as doctors might be different. So we again rely on this hospitalist idea that sometimes by chance patients are seen by male doctors versus female doctors. And there what we found was that the mortality rate for patients who by chance are seen by a female hospital physician is lower 30 days after hospitalization than those seen by a male physician. And there's reasons that might be true, none of which we can sort of pin down. It could be differences between the time spent between female doctors and their patients. There was a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine that suggests that that might be true, at least in the outpatient setting. Maybe it generalizes to the hospital. It might be differences in clinical reasoning or diagnosis. So outside of medicine, there's good evidence that, for example, investments, that men tend to be more risk averse. So is it the case in medicine, for example, that male doctors might anchor in on diagnoses prematurely or faster than a female physician would? If so, you could imagine that there'd be higher rates of misdiagnosis. So there's a lot of things that might explain it. The take home, of course, is not that we should take all male doctors and make them females. It's really also part of a broader social commentary about, women doctors in medicine are actually doing quite well, if not better. But also to figure out, all right, well, what is it that they might be doing differently that can be replicated by everybody, both female doctors who are doing it, as well as male doctors who aren't doing it?
I want to jump in just there and say that I wrote a paper about a year ago with a colleague from Amsterdam, and the title was something like "Medicine She is Male." Now, our point was that our construct of physicianhood for centuries has been a male construct, and only recently have we got this equality with the numbers of trainees in medicine being more women actually than men. But all the metrics and all the things that we consider part of physicianhood are all sort of male derived, and some of them may actually be detrimental. The sort of rising to the top, power, consolidating protocols. They're the opposite of nurturing humanism. So I, for one, when we wrote that paper and I came across these studies showing women do better, was really gratified, because I think it was sort of validating the touchy-feely side of medicine that increasingly in our obsession with data, we just sort of leap right over.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, if you think about, I'm an economist, so we think a lot about things like cost. So if you look at American medicine, cost is a thing that most health policy scholars talk a lot about. Cost of medical care, being medications or going to the doctor, being in the hospital. But even in situations where people don't face any direct medical costs, maybe the medication is free, we still observe that they are adherent to the medications only about 50% of the time. So what gives? Like, why is it the case that if something is free and we think it's beneficial for their health, they don't do it? Now, I think that's where, Abraham, some of these quote unquote touchy-feely things might come into play, because it is also about trust. Like, if I don't perceive there to be a need personally for me to take this medication, if I don't trust the messenger, maybe I'm less likely to take it. And so to the extent that we see differences between male and female physicians, which we have seen in adherence to medications by their patients, if that's a function of some of these softer attributes, which are probably have hard importance, that's something we need to know more about.
Yeah, I think also that way you characterize, actually both of you, about the differences in gender specific medical care. You also touched on more adherence to guidelines, but I think the reflection about time spent with more with patients may also go along with Abraham's allusion to the more compassion that is generally seen. Obviously, there's no shortage of exceptions, but maybe that's a general trend. Now, I did want to get to the cardiologist because I have a interest there.
There's
a chapter which I basically agreed with you with this observation, but it's fascinating, right? So every year, particularly years ago, when the American Heart Association, the entire leading cardiologists would flock to the meeting. It's not so much the case these days, but it used to be. And you studied that and found out you're a lot safer if you go to the hospital during the American Heart Association convention. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So first of all, I thought that the opposite would be true because I remember being a trainee, and it was around the time of one of these big meetings, either the American Heart Association or American College of Cardiology. And it just felt like the staffing was different. I don't know if it was different, but it felt that way. And so it put this idea into my head of, gee, I wonder what happens to people who have acute cardiac problems when doctors are away at these big, or cardiologists are away at these big meetings. And if you look at the data, what you see is that the hospital mortality or 30-day mortality after coming in with, let's say, a cardiac arrest or very severe heart failure is lower during the dates of these meetings. And this is a good natural experiment. I could say that conceptually because people don't choose to have their heart attack when the AHA or ACC are holding meetings. They probably have never heard of those organizations, much less choosing to have their heart attack around the time or not around the time, right? It's like totally random. And you can see that in the data. The characteristics of patients are just like at a table 1 in a randomized trial. They're as good as random, similar in meeting dates and non-meeting dates. So something that's causing the mortality difference is coming from the behavior changes of the cardiologists that remain behind. The other data point was that we found that rates of certain procedures, so we focus on stenting because that's something that we can measure quite well, fall by about 30% during the dates of the meetings. And so I think what's going on is that, and the story I'll tell is as follows. You imagine you've got two people. One is a 40-year-old guy who's a construction worker, and he has chest pain when he's working at the construction site. And he goes to the emergency department. He has an EKG performed. He has a heart attack. They confirm that with some lab tests. He gets a stent, and he goes home in 2 days, does really well. The second person is a 90-year-old woman who has 10 different medical problems. She has the exact same chest pain at her nursing home. She gets brought into the same ED. She gets an EKG. It's the exact same as the first guy. And she gets lab tests drawn. They look the exact same as the first guy as well. So she also gets a stent, but she dies within, a week or 2 weeks of the procedure because of complications. That sort of story, I think, would be well understood by most people. And what it gets at is that we often perform medical care as if it's black and white. And sometimes it is black and white, but other times it's quite gray, or it could even be black and white in the other direction. We just don't know it's the case. And so I don't think that, obviously, cardiologists aren't intentionally trying to harm 90-year-old women who are coming in with chest pain, for sure, right? But it's the desire to help, the desire to do something that sometimes backfires if the risk-benefit is not favorable for that type of person.
Has anyone ever looked at the first month of internship and what that does to mortality in academic medical centers? My theory is actually that it's safer. I mean, I used to attend often in that month, and I felt like everybody was much more wary. And I wondered if there is data.
There is, but so I'll say two things. Unfortunately, it doesn't line up with what we would hope. They call this the July effect, and we've actually looked at this in cardiac care. If you look at people who happen to be hospitalized in July in academic medical centers versus, let's say, May or June in those same centers, and you do the same thing in non-academic medical centers as sort of a control group, you do tend to see that mortality is higher in July. But it's not a uniform finding, Abraham. Sometimes you see it, sometimes you don't. And our insight was maybe we're looking at the wrong place. You can't just look at the typical hospital patient because it really does take a lot to go wrong for them to be harmed and die as a result of that care. But if you look at really high-risk patients, like high-risk cardiac patients, even small errors might matter. And we see pretty large, what I'd call July effects as a result. But what you're saying is exactly right. The care patterns do change, right? They're aware of that problem, and so they adjust to it. And if they hadn't adjusted, I think the mortality effect would be even larger. But it gets to the same idea that on a rainy day, you would think that traffic mortalities will typically go up because the rain makes it harder to see. Roads are more slippery. right? But there's also a compensating effect, which is that fewer people go outside in the rain, and they're also aware that it's raining. And that's where problems arise. It's when you're not aware of the underlying threat that you're particularly susceptible to a problem. But if you're aware of it, you can adapt. It may not offset the primary effect, but at least compensates.
I'm curious about your sort of mechanics of writing this book. I mean, I think writing any book is sort of a architectural, challenge, and then you're doing it with another co-author. But it came off beautifully. I really love the book. But talk a bit, if you would, about the process.
Sure. Yeah. So for years now, I've been thinking about writing something. In part because a lot of this work is very approachable. You don't have to be in medicine to understand the underlying thought experiment that it's at play here. And I trained at the University of Chicago, and I was trying to think about how, what would be a way to take those kinds of studies, which I think people would be interested in, maybe learn something about, and put them into a book. Because, Abraham, you're right that this is not sort of a collection of short stories. We try to do something more than that. We try to take a finding and then expand on it to tell us what does this teach us about how healthcare works, where it works poorly, how it could work better. And I met Chris Worsham is a critical care doctor and health policy researcher at Harvard. And I met Chris about 5 or 6 years ago. We started working together on a number of different topics. And this is around the time I was thinking about writing a book, but I knew I didn't want to do it alone. And so I talked to Chris. I said, Chris, do you want to do this with me? And he had similar interests in this style of work, this style of thinking. And, it came together nicely. So we had a good working relationship, but it wouldn't have been possible without him. That's there's no other way to say it.
It's terrific. And having a critical care physician with a lot of the things that you were doing about, analysis in hospital, as you've been reviewing, certainly added another dimension. So the last chapter was about politics, and how that's influencing a lot of these biases that you so well articulate throughout the book. Can you give us a sense about the overall impact of politics, particularly you get to that in the United States?
Yeah, and so we saved sort of almost the most controversial for last, because this has obviously been a heated issue in the last few years with the pandemic. So, we start by talking about some of the studies on how politics could influence medical care. And it can do so in a lot of ways. So we, for example, talk about what happens when healthcare systems get acquired by Catholic hospital systems. The types of care that's offered changes. So that's sort of a system way in which religion could permeate, or politics could permeate how care is provided. We had a study that we spent some time on in the book where we took information from U.S. physicians. We had information on their political donations because that's public record. So we linked this data. We looked at the care provided by Republican and Democrat physicians when their patients were at the end of life. These are people who were in the hospital, who die in the hospital or shortly thereafter. And we look at things like whether or not they are more or less likely to be in the ICU, to be mechanically ventilated, to have feeding tubes placed, things like that. And we don't find any evidence that Republican and Democrat doctors treat patients any differently, which is sort of, for us, a very reassuring finding that, at least in this domain, we don't see much going on. And then we sort of switch gears over to COVID-19, and we kind of intentionally had not spoken much about the pandemic in the book. And then we talk about a few different studies, one of which I did, which was quite interesting. We basically were interested in the question of whether or not people were, whether or not small social gatherings early in the pandemic with people that you knew and trust were a driver of disease spread. And that was a hard question to study, because think about the type of data you would need. You need to know for hundreds of thousands, if not more people, when they were gathering, whether or not they got COVID-19, which is both big data problems. You can't get that kind of data. And then 3 is whether or not there were other things that they were doing that were different. People who gather might be more likely to travel, less likely to wear masks, all sorts of other behaviors. And the way we got around that is that, okay, well, there's one reason that people might gather, and that's your birthday. And it's in, part because we had a daughter who turned 5, and we thought about celebrating her birthday in person in the beginning of the pandemic, but we did it by Zoom. If you look at people in any given city in which a household has a member with a birthday, that household is about 30% more likely to have a COVID-19 diagnosis in the 2 weeks following that birthday than an otherwise similar household in that same city in that same week. And we're looking at hundreds of thousands of households. And this is a natural experiment because the birthdays are pretty random, right? There's no reason that you would think that a household with a birthday in it would be more likely to get COVID-19 unless they were gathering for that birthday. And the effect, what I call a birthday effect, was stronger in households in which the child had a birthday. No surprise, it's easier to ignore a birthday if it's your 55th birthday versus your child's 6th birthday. And the politics angle was as follows. We found that this birthday effect was identical in highly Republican and highly Democrat counties. And to me, that was interesting because in the beginning of the pandemic and even throughout, there's been this sort of polarized discussion of what Republicans do and what Democrats do when it comes to public health behaviors, whether it's masking or social distancing, vaccine adoption, whatever it is. And that's what people say, right? They might say it in surveys. They certainly talk about it on social media. The question is, what do they actually do? And when you look at the behaviors here, we saw very similar patterns between Republican and Democrat counties, at least in this one domain. It changes, though, when the vaccines come around. And that's another study that we talk about by Jacob Wallace and others at Yale. When the vaccines come around, we start to see a divergence between Republican and Democrat areas of the country. So it's sort of a complicated story, but the way I would kind of put it together is that the differences that we talked about or that we continue to talk about in the pandemic are there, but they're probably much less than the similarities that all groups have shared. We just tend to focus on the sort of differences, which I don't think makes a lot of sense, and it doesn't do good for policy.
You talk a lot about we looked at this and we looked at that, and for someone who's not sort of database the way you are, where do you look and what kind of databases are you using and what's the engine behind all this? Because I couldn't begin to. I could answer the question, but I'd have no idea how to go about looking for birthdays and COVID and so on.
Good question. Well, I think there's a couple of engines. One engine is the idea. I always think that that's the most important part. But you have an idea, like I had an idea about a birthday and COVID-19. So where do we go? So anytime a person goes and sees a doctor, the doctor will bill the insurance company for that care. And that information is recorded by insurance companies. If a patient goes to the pharmacy and fills a prescription for a medication and the insurer pays for that prescription, that information is recorded by the insurance company. And so insurance companies have assembled these really kind of voluminous and comprehensive data that allows us to know something about the medical care that people are receiving, what kind of medications they're taking, what kind of doctors or hospitals or therapists they're going to, and what they're being diagnosed with. And that data is all, Abraham, it's all anonymized. So it's not as if I can see a particular person who I know and look up their information. It's not like an electronic health record. It is all completely anonymized data that is used by people like me to study these sorts of questions. So that's where the data is. And then there's statistical work, or we say econometrics work that goes into all of these findings. But at its core, most of the stuff that we talk about in the book and most of the stuff that I do, it doesn't really require any fancy statistical work, which is, I think, is a virtue, right? Because when I see a paper that says that this drug is associated with this condition or this side effect, and the statisticians account or correct for a number of different factors, that gives me a lot of pause because, I view these sort of variables, what we call confounders. They're almost like, pests or rodents. If you see one, there's others. You just don't see them. They're there though. And economists have long appreciated that. That's why we focus on randomization. So all the studies that I do or that I try to do, I want them to have a simple interpretation, which is if people are quasi-randomized to this intervention or that, what is the outcome? And then we can attribute it to that difference in what they're exposed to. Well,
and to your point, Bapu, about even randomized trials, basically baseline characteristics are hardly ever really balanced between the two groups or three groups. And then you have this cumulative effect of small differences that may not be statistically significant that are like the rodents or they're confounders. Now, before we wrap up, you didn't really get to it in the book at all, but because this is the Medicine and Machine podcast, I want to get to the machine angle. So as you allude to, MD can stand for make diagnosis. And we know there's lots of errors, biases, human biases. And there's a promise out there that maybe, of course, AI can help with these things because of perhaps, working around some of the biases that we have, some of the things that we've been reviewing just during this conversation. Have you thought about that, about how we can go from random acts of medicine to AI-supported better practice of medicine with less errors? I wonder what you think about it.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of promise, and it probably comes in maybe 3 different flavors. So one flavor is it's not so sexy, but it's sort of a data flavor, which is the following. With all this data that is available about people, when a person walks into the door, a computer, a machine should be able to synthesize information that a physician or another practitioner will just not be able to see because it's not available to them in their record, or they don't have the time to process that information. So I think one benefit of AI is to be able to cull all of this information together in a way that is not possible for the physician. The second thing is that in areas where pattern recognition is really important, like EKGs, I think there's a big scope. And I think it happens through 2 ways. One is that it helps doctors identify patterns that we know exist, but that the individual doctor has failed to see. So, for example, if someone has chest pain, they get an EKG, and the EKG demonstrates that this person is having a particular type of heart attack. If the findings are a little subtle, the cardiologist or the doctor may not pick up on it, right? And so that's a misdiagnosis, even though the pattern was there and another doctor would have picked it up. But there's a separate place where AI can come in by establishing patterns that are new to us as human beings, as doctors, that we don't know exist, because we know what we know. But there's other features of EKGs. If you took 1 million people who have EKGs performed on them, and you look at those who have heart attacks and those who do not, there are other signatures in those electrocardiograms that we as humans don't know to pick up on. And the machine can do that because it is looking at all these waveforms in a way that we don't know yet. So I think there's a lot of value there in sort of predicting diagnoses. And then the last place is, I think, the diagnosis is critical in medicine, right? And so doctors often have a narrow set of diagnoses that they work with, that they're familiar with. At the very minimum, a computer could say to the doctor, here are 5 different diagnoses that you haven't considered. Consider these. And the doctor can look at it and say, yeah, I think this is good or bad. Check, no, and then proceed forward. But at least they're presented with that information to be able to say, all right, I agree or disagree with this, and then they move on. So I think there's a lot of opportunities there.
Great.
Well, I must say it's been a wonderful experience to read the book and also to chat with you. And I can't wait to see what natural experiments you're now have your eye on or will have your eye on. So thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah,
thank you both.
Bapu, just to congratulate you and Chris for this book. It's a gift. It's a gift for the medical community to be more in touch with the kind of kooky things out there or explanations that they might not have considered. And also for the public, for the broader readership, just because they can learn about things that they might not otherwise even have had an inkling about. So it really portrays the brilliance of you and Chris in putting this book together, and a lot of the publications that you've done, work you've done that antedated the book. And we hope we'll be hearing a lot more from you because you've got a lot to offer the medical community. So thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much.